The storage room at St. Marguerite General smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, and that was where Declan found her. He hadn't meant to go in. He was looking for the supply closet on the East Wing, third night into his undercover rotation, still getting his bearings in the fluorescent maze of the hospital's lower floor. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. She was sitting on an overturned crate between two shelving units, still in her scrubs, a paper cup cradled in both hands like she was trying to absorb its warmth. She wasn't crying loudly. It was the kind of crying that's almost silent, shoulders moving, breath caught in careful intervals, the way people cry when they've learned not to make noise about it. She looked up, startled. "Sorry," she said immediately. Not "who are you" or "what do you want," just sorry. Like the grief was her fault. Declan stood in the doorway. "I'm the one intruding." She pressed the back of her wrist to her eye. Her name tag read Celia, RN, night shift. She looked young, late 20s, maybe, with dark circles that had the settled look of months. Not one bad night. "I'm fine," she said. The words came out flat, practiced. The words of someone who has said them so many times they've stopped meaning anything. Declan didn't believe. He didn't know exactly why. He leaned against the door frame and said, "You don't have to be." She looked at him. Really looked, the way people do when they're deciding whether a stranger is safe. "We lost a patient tonight," she said finally. "Room 4212. He was 7 years old." She stopped. "I know it's part of the job. Everyone tells you that. It's part of the job, Celia. You have to compartmentalize, Celia." She laughed, but it came out hollow. I can't always do that." Declan said nothing. There was nothing to say. "He used to save me a drawing every Tuesday," she continued, quieter now. "He'd have his mum bring them in. Little rockets, little dogs, once a dinosaur that he told me was specifically a brachiosaurus, not just a dinosaur, very important distinction." Her voice cracked on the last few words. Declan looked at the floor. The lump in his throat had arrived uninvited. "I'm sorry," he said. And he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with being polite. Celia wiped her face and stood. "I've got rounds in 10. She straightened her badge. The instinct to keep moving, to keep functioning, he recognized it. He'd seen it before. In people who didn't have the option of falling apart. He stepped aside to let her pass. She paused in the doorway without turning around. "Thanks," she said, "for not telling me it gets easier." Then she was gone, back into the bright corridor, back into the work of caring for everyone else. Declan stood alone in the supply room for a long moment. The paper cup she'd left behind still held a curl of steam. At 41, Declan Marsh was not a man people pictured pushing a mop cart through a hospital corridor. He was the founder and CEO of Norlight Health Systems, one of Canada's largest healthcare management corporations, headquartered in Ottawa with operations spanning 7 provinces. The company managed administrative and staffing infrastructure for over 60 hospitals and long-term care facilities. His name appeared in business journals. His face appeared at galas. He wore the kind of suits that made people instinctively step aside. But no one at St. Marguerite General knew that. Here he was Declan Murray. He'd used his mother's maiden name, a contract maintenance technician filling a temporary placement while their regular night shift guy recovered from knee surgery. He'd arranged it quietly through 3 layers of HR so the trail wouldn't lead back to him. No one in this building knew who he actually was. The decision to go undercover had not been impulsive. It had been building for months. It started with an exit survey. Norlight's internal HR team ran quarterly staff retention analyses across all managed facilities, and in the most recent report, St. Marguerite had flagged at the top for voluntary turnover, nursing staff, specifically night shift. The numbers were stark. 31% annual turnover. The industry average was 18. Declan had asked for qualitative follow-up. The responses came back in bullet points. Management culture, lack of support, feeling invisible, burnout, no one listens. Then came the voice message. One of the senior nurses, 23 years at the hospital, had somehow gotten the general inquiry number for Norlight's corporate office and left a message on a Tuesday afternoon that no one flagged to him for 6 weeks. When he finally heard it, he had to listen twice. "I don't know if anyone will hear this," she'd said, "but I want someone to know that the people here are good, they work hard, they care, and something is happening to them, slowly, and I don't know if anyone in the offices notices or cares. We used to feel like we were part of something. Now we feel like a cost on a spreadsheet. I just thought someone should know." Declan had sat with that message for a long time. He'd started Norlight because of his mother. Margaret Marsh had worked for 30 years as a dietary aide at a long-term care home in Sudbury, Ontario. She came home tired in ways that didn't leave when she slept. She never complained, that wasn't her, but Declan had seen it, the fluorescent pallor of her days off, the way she sighed sometimes when she thought no one was listening. She had died at 63, 2 years before he'd turned his fledgling consulting firm into what would become Norlight. He had told himself then that he was building something for people like her, for the workers who showed up every day and were invisible to the systems they kept running. Somewhere in the expansion, the acquisitions, the board meetings, the quarterly targets, he had stopped checking whether that was still true. The voice message made him think it wasn't. So here he was. Third week at St. Marguerite. Mopping floors, replacing IV pole wheels, hauling biohazard bags to the service elevator at 2 in the morning while the hospital breathed its slow overnight breath around him. His back hurt in places he'd forgotten could hurt. His hands were dry from the sanitizer, and for the first time in years he felt like he was somewhere real. He began to notice Celia the way you notice something that doesn't fit the ambient noise. She was always there, every night shift, every corridor. She worked register, no, wrong building, wrong memory. She worked the floor, room checks, medication rounds, IV adjustments, the 100 small urgencies that stacked up between midnight and 6. But it was how she worked that caught his attention. There was a quietness to her efficiency, not coldness, the opposite. She was warm with patience in a way that seemed almost costly, like it drew from a reserve she was careful to replenish. He watched her kneel beside an elderly man in the hallway who'd wandered from his room, confused, looking for a window he remembered from childhood. She didn't call for an orderly. She sat with him on the bench near the fire exit and talked to him quietly about the view until he was calm enough to walk back. She was supposed to be on a medication round. She came back to it afterward, 15 minutes behind, without mentioning why. He watched her translate instructions into simpler words for a woman whose English was limited, repeating herself without impatience until the woman nodded, really nodded, the nod of someone who understood rather than someone who'd given up trying. He watched her eat her lunch alone at 4 a.m. in the hallway near the stairwell, reading something on her phone with that expression people have when they're reading to stay awake, not because they're interested. Once he came around a corner and nearly walked into her. She was pressed against the wall, eyes closed, just breathing. 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then she straightened, smoothed her scrub top, and walked back toward her patients. He pretended he hadn't seen. There was a quality to her endurance he couldn't name. Not toughness. Toughness was something you displayed. This was different. It was just the fact of her continuing. The way water continues, not because it's trying. He found himself thinking about the supply room. We lost a patient tonight. The way she'd said it. Not performing grief, not managing it, just carrying it. The way someone carries something too heavy to put down. One night, near the end of the 3rd week, he was restocking the medication cart alcove when she came around the corner and stopped short, surprised to see him. "Hey," she said, "you're the new maintenance guy." "Declan," he said. "Celia." She leaned against the wall, peeling off a glove. She looked tired in that specific way that meant she'd pushed past tired into some quieter place on the other side. "You're here every night." "So are you." She smiled, a small, real smile, not the professional one. "Fair." He handed her the extra coffee he'd made, a habit he'd developed, always making 2, and she took it without question, which told him something about how long it had been since someone had just offered her something without conditions. They stood there for a few minutes, the hospital hummed around them. "You like it here?" he asked. "The work?" She considered that seriously, the way people do when they've decided not to give the easy answer. "I like the patients," she said. "I like knowing that what I do today matters to someone tonight. That's rare, I think, to have that clarity. She turned the cup in her hands. The rest of it's harder. The system. The system, she agreed. The way it grinds on people. Good people. Nurses who've been here 15 years who feel like they've become invisible, aides who work doubles because we're short-staffed, and then get written up if they're 5 minutes late clocking in. She stopped. Sorry, you don't need to hear this. I do, actually, Declan said. She looked at him sideways. He held her gaze. I've been watching it for 3 weeks, he said carefully. You're right. The good people are here. They're just not being looked after. She studied him for a moment with a nurse's directness, the kind of look that was used to reading people fast and accurately. Why are you here? She asked, not accusatory. Just curious, like she'd already decided he wasn't quite what he appeared to be. Trying to remember something, he said. She accepted that without pushing it. That was the thing about Celia. He was already learning. She didn't push. She waited. And the waiting had its own kind of weight. 3 nights later, he found out why she stayed. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't sit him down and tell him. He overheard pieces of a phone call she made in the stairwell at the end of her shift, thinking she was alone. I know, Mom, I know. Just tell him I'll be there before he wakes up, okay? I'm leaving now. Tell him I've got his pancakes at home. A pause. He didn't wake up again? Okay, okay, okay. I'll be fast. Another pause, longer. Her voice dropped. Is he asking for him again? Declan stopped on the landing above and didn't move. It's okay, she said into the phone. Just tell him Dad's busy. Working. Yeah, I know. Her voice had gone very quiet. I know, Mum. I'll figure out what to tell him. Not yet. He's 4. I can't. She stopped. Exhaled. I know. He understood, without needing the rest, the particular shape of that silence. She was protecting a child from something the child wasn't old enough to survive knowing yet. He waited until her footsteps had faded down the stairwell before he moved. That night, sitting in the parking lot of the extended stay hotel he'd been living in for 3 weeks, Declan sat with the engine off and the windows fogging slowly, and thought about his mother. About the way she'd worked doubles without complaint and come home and made him soup, and never let the house feel like a hard place to be, even when the money was tight or the job was heavy. About the pride she'd taken in her work that no one from management had ever acknowledged. About how she'd said once, almost to herself, Declan, the secret is, you find the people worth showing up for. Then you just keep showing up. He thought about Celia eating alone at 4 a.m. He thought about a 4-year-old boy waiting for pancakes and asking for his dad. He thought about what it meant to run a company that touched hundreds of places like this one, and to have slowly, without meaning to, drained them of the thing that made them matter. He got out his phone and sat there for a long time. Then he made a call. Over the following week, he worked quietly through channels he trusted, not corporate, personal. He reached out to an old friend who ran a family support nonprofit out of Winnipeg, someone who knew how to move resources without making noise. He arranged for a grocery delivery account to be opened under a neutral name and linked to Celia's home address, which he'd found through her employee file with the kind of access he wasn't supposed to have, and used with more care than he'd ever used it before. The first delivery arrived with a note on plain card stock, no logo. From someone who sees how hard you work. Don't argue. Just eat. He had her shift schedule adjusted, quietly, through the staffing coordinator, framed as a system optimization, so she no longer pulled back-to-back doubles on Fridays. It meant someone else had to pick up the hours. He made sure that person was compensated. He couldn't fix everything. He couldn't bring back whatever she'd lost. But he could do this, push against the system where he could reach it, in ways small enough not to frighten her. There was something else, though. Something he hadn't told her. Something he was still turning over. On the 4th night, he'd been sorting through a box of old equipment manifests in the maintenance office when he'd found, tucked between 2 folders, an old hospital newsletter, the kind printed on cream paper that places used to produce before everything went digital. It was from 14 years ago. He almost tossed it. Then a name in the headline caught him. Dr. Raymond Okafor honored for Community Medicine Award. He read the article. Then he read it again. The name didn't hit him immediately, but the details did. A family doctor who had run a free walk-in clinic out of a church basement in Scarborough, volunteering weekends for 12 years. Who had diagnosed Declan's mother with the kidney condition that had ultimately taken her life, but who had caught it 3 years earlier than it might otherwise have been caught. Who had sat with her for 40 minutes in an examination room and explained every option, printed out resources, called a specialist himself, and stayed on hold for 20 minutes to get her an appointment. Who had called Declan afterward. She'd listed him as her son and next of kin, just to tell him she's going to be okay for a while yet. She just needs to know she has support. Declan had called him once after his mother's death to thank him. The call went to voicemail. He'd left a message. He never heard back. Life had moved on. Dr. Raymond Okafor. The article said he'd joined St. Marguerite's General Practice Division in the years since, and at the bottom of the article, in small type under the photograph, Dr. Okafor is survived by his wife, Andrea, and daughter, Celia. Declan sat very still at the maintenance desk. He looked at the photograph. A man in his 50s, wide smile, arm around a teenage girl with dark eyes and the particular expression of someone who is trying to be composed for a photo, but is actually deeply proud. Her father. Her father had been the doctor who had spent 40 minutes with Declan's mother and made a call that had bought her and him 3 more years. He drove back to the hotel and sat in the dark for a long time. He found the rest of it slowly. Public records, an obituary in the Toronto Star, a small remembrance notice from St. Marguerite's own newsletter. Dr. Raymond Okafor had died during the early months of the pandemic. Overexposure, organ failure, complications. He was 58. He had kept seeing patients in person when it was still unclear how dangerous that was, because his patients were elderly, isolated, and didn't have family to bring them in. The obituary described him as someone who believed that the covenant between a doctor and patient had no asterisks. Celia's father. The 4-year-old asking about his grandfather, or no. The phone call. He's asking for him again. The dad. The boy's father. There were 2 losses here. He'd only understood one of them. He thought about what it meant to be carrying all of that and still showing up. Still sitting with a 7-year-old patient every Tuesday to look at rockets and brachiosauruses and not letting any of it leak through. He thought about his mother, about the phone call she'd never known he'd receive. He thought very clearly, I am not walking away from this. The shift supervisor called a brief all-staff gathering at the end of night shift on a Thursday. No notice, just a message sent through the internal system. Please remain for a short building announcement. 7 a.m. Atrium. Celia arrived already in her coat, keys in her hand, running on 2 hours of sleep, and the particular determination of someone who has promised a 4-year-old pancakes. She found a chair near the back and sat down. The atrium slowly filled with the quiet confusion of night shift staff, nurses, aides, cleaning staff, maintenance workers. Declan was there, near the side wall, still in his maintenance uniform. He caught her eye. She gave him a small nod. He looked, she thought, like he hadn't slept either. The hospital administrator stepped up and introduced a guest from the managing corporation. She said the name plainly, Declan Marsh, CEO of Norlight Health Systems. The room went still. Celia turned to look toward the front of the room, and the man who walked up was Declan. Same face, same posture, but wearing a blazer over the same plain shirt and carrying himself the way people do when they've stopped pretending to be something smaller than they are. She felt the floor shift in some way that had nothing to do with the floor. He looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. Then he said, I need to start by being honest with you about why I'm here. He told them, all of it, that he'd come undercover because the numbers had stopped meaning anything to him, because he'd received a voice message from a nurse with 23 years of service who'd felt like she was disappearing, because his company was supposed to be built on the belief that the people doing the work were the most important part of the whole operation, and because he'd needed to see for himself whether that was still true. It is, he said. You're still here. You're still showing up. What isn't working is the system around you, and that's something I can actually do something about." He spoke about specific changes, not vague commitments. Specific ones. A mental health support fund for night shift staff, a staffing ratio review that would begin within the month, a formal recognition program that wasn't a laminated certificate in a break room, but an actual salary adjustment tied to tenure and peer commendation. He'd spent the week building it, working with people he trusted, and it was already drafted. Then he said, "There's someone here who reminded me why I started. Not by anything she said to me directly. She didn't know who I was. But by the way she works. By the way she treats people when there's no one watching and nothing to gain. By the way she keeps going." He said her name. Celia went very still. "I want to tell you something about your father," Declan said quietly. The room had receded. There was only this. He told her about his mother, Margaret, about a free clinic appointment 14 years ago, about a doctor who had stayed on hold for 20 minutes and made a call and sat with a frightened woman for 40 minutes longer than the schedule allowed because that was who he was. He told her about the phone call he'd received afterward. He told her about the voicemail he'd left and never had returned. He said, "I never got to thank him properly. I want you to know that what he did for her, for us, is part of why I built what I built. I just forgot to keep building it the way he would have recognized." Celia's hands were pressed flat on her knees. "He was a good doctor," Declan said. "But it sounds like he was a better father." She stood up. She didn't plan to. Her body just decided. She walked to the front of the room and stopped in front of him, and she looked at him for a long moment, with the same directness she turned on him in the stairwell, the look that saw fast and saw clearly, and then she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "He would have liked you." The room, when she turned back toward it, was blurred. Declan reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and brought out something small and folded. He held it out to her. She took it without looking at it. She unfolded it carefully. It was a photograph, printed from a scan. She could tell, slightly soft at the edges, but unmistakable. Her father. Younger than she remembered, maybe mid-40s. He was standing in what she recognized as the church basement where he'd run his Saturday clinic for years. He was laughing at something off camera. She had never seen this photograph. She didn't know where it had come from. Probably the newsletter archives. But he was laughing, and it was real, and it was him, and she had not heard his laugh in 4 years. She had to sit down. He sat beside her. The room kindly gave them a moment. Later, weeks later, months later, when Celia tried to explain to her mother how things had changed, she found it difficult to locate the exact seam. It wasn't a single moment. It was the accumulation of small ones. It was walking into work and knowing the staffing ratio had been reviewed and she would not be pulled in 3 directions at once. It was the message she received from a Norlight coordinator asking, specifically, what resources would have helped her most in the months after her father's death, and whether the hospital had provided them, and listening without hurrying when she answered. It was the recognition fund that paid out the month after her father's anniversary and arrived in her account with a note that said only, "For those who keep showing up." It was Declan, texting her on a Sunday morning. "My hotel checkout was at 11, and I may have accidentally agreed to brunch. Is there somewhere in this city that serves actual eggs Benedict and not a deconstructed version of it?" She had laughed, genuinely, for the first time, and she couldn't remember. She brought him to a diner on Elgin Street that had been there since before she was born, with laminate menus and a cook who called everyone Han without irony. They sat by the window. He was terrible at being casual. She could see him trying, but he was good at listening. He was very good at that. Her son, Oliver, was 4.5, and he was at his grandmother's. But on the 3rd Sunday Celia brought him. He was wearing a dinosaur backpack because he wore it everywhere. He climbed into the booth, studied Declan with the frank assessment that only small children and very experienced nurses could manage, and then said, "Do you know about brachiosauruses?" Declan glanced at Celia. She gave nothing away. "Tell me," he said. Oliver told him. At length. Declan asked questions, real questions, not performed ones, and Oliver answered them with the authority of someone who had thought about this a great deal. By the time the eggs arrived, Oliver had decided that Declan was acceptable, and it moved on to telling him about a painting he'd made at school that was, in his assessment, quite realistic. His grandfather would have done exactly that, Celia said quietly across the table. Just asked. Really asked. Declan looked at Oliver, who was explaining something about paint with a fork in one hand. He sounds like he was someone worth knowing. He was. The three of them ate in the warm light of the diner, the street outside gray with February. It was not a grand moment. Nothing was resolved or transformed in the way stories sometimes require. But Celia felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the sensation of not being alone inside her own life. On Oliver's 5th birthday, she took him to the cemetery where her father was buried. She brought daffodils, which had been his favorite, and a drawing Oliver had made, a doctor with a stethoscope and a very large head, which was, Oliver explained seriously, because his brain was so big. She leaned the drawing against the headstone. Declan was there. He'd come without being asked. She'd mentioned it the week before, and he'd said simply, "I'll be there if you want company." He stood a little back, giving them space, until Oliver ran over and grabbed his hand and said, "Come see Grandpa's stone. It has his name on it." And Declan came. He crouched beside the headstone. Oliver told him about his grandfather in the earnest, slightly confused way of someone who has been given the shape of a story without yet being old enough to feel its weight. He knows Grandpa was a doctor. He knows Grandpa was brave. He knows Grandpa is gone, though the architecture of gone is still a work in progress for someone who is 5. He sounds like he was a really good man, Declan said. Mum says he's still here, Oliver told him quite matter-of-fact. Just different. Declan looked up at Celia. She looked back. "I think that's right," Declan said. He stood and he put his hand briefly against the stone and quietly, not for anyone else to hear, he said what he'd never managed to say through voicemail 14 years ago. Just a few words. Just a debt repaid. Just a thank you that arrived late and landed in the only place it could. Celia reached for his hand. They stood together in the February wind, the three of them, daffodils bending in the cold. Oliver had moved on to examining an interesting pebble. The world continued its indifferent turning. But here, in this small space, something had been made right, not in the way that erases the loss, but in the way that says, it mattered, you were seen, and someone kept the faith. And sometimes, quietly, that is enough. I keep coming back to that storage room. The antiseptic smell. The paper cup still steaming after she'd gone. The way she said sorry before she said anything else, like she'd been taught somewhere along the way that her grief was an inconvenience to the people around her. I think about the kind of person it takes to live that way, to lose a father, to lose a husband, to still show up at midnight, still kneel beside a confused old man in a hallway, still ask a dying 7-year-old what kind of dinosaur that is and mean it. Not because anyone is watching, not because there's a reward, just because that's who Celia is. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about during those weeks at St. Marguerite. Not the staffing numbers, not the turnover report. Her. The fact that someone like her existed inside a system that had never once stopped to ask how she was doing. We talk a lot about character, what it means, where it comes from. I used to think it was something you build deliberately, through decisions and effort. And maybe it is, partly. But watching Celia work, I started to think it's also something quieter than that. It's the thing that remains when everything else has been taken. When the job is hard and the nights are long and the system doesn't see you and the grief hasn't gone anywhere, and you still show up and you still care and you still ask the real questions. That's not performance. That's just who you decided to be. Maybe without even deciding, just by doing it over and over until it's the only way you know how to live. Her father was the same. Dr. Raymond Okafor stayed on hold for 20 minutes for a patient who wasn't exceptional by any administrative measure. He saw patients in person when it wasn't safe because they didn't have anyone else. He didn't do those things because he calculated the outcome. He did them because his understanding of what a doctor owed a person had no exceptions in it. That's a kind of moral clarity that most of us spend our whole lives approximating. And what I keep sitting with is this. All of it came back around. Not in a mystical way, just in the plain, quiet way that actions have consequences over time. Raymond's 20 minutes on hold gave my mother 3 more years. Those 3 years gave me the grief and the purpose that became Norlight. Norlight brought me to St. Marguerite. St. Marguerite brought me to Celia. The thread was always there. I just hadn't been paying attention. I think that's what I'd lost somewhere in the expansion. The attention, the willingness to actually look at the person in front of me and ask what they need and mean it. Declan Marsh. The CEO had gotten very good at systems and very bad at that. Oliver asking a stranger about brachiosauruses with absolute confidence that the stranger would be interested. That's the version of intelligence I want to practice, the kind that assumes connection is possible, that asks the real question without protecting itself first. I don't know if I've earned the ending this story gave me, but I know what it's asking of me going forward. To keep looking, to keep asking. To not confuse being busy with being present. Celia taught me that without trying to, and some lessons, I think, only arrive through the people who've already learned them the hard way.